If you mention the city of Madison to residents of the Hoosier State, they'll tell you of its stunning beauty and rich history. Located in Jefferson County, Indiana, Madison is known for its presence on the mighty Ohio River. Founded in 1809 while Indiana was still just a territory, the easy access from the Ohio River and the Michigan Road allowed the city to grow and flourish. Madison would eventually become the busiest river town along the Ohio, surpassing even Cincinnati and Louisville in riverboat traffic prior to the 1850s. In addition to the river's influence in Madison's early growth, the state's first railroad arrived in 1836, further stimulating the local economy. Today, that very same railroad line, now owned and operated by the City of Madison Port Authority, continues to impact the local economy with first-class freight service between Madison and North Vernon, Indiana. It's been a long road of twists and turns for the Madison Railroad since her first day of operation in 1978. But 40 years later, she's a survivor, and this is her story. Celebrating 40 years of local service nationwide. When the state of Indiana entered the Union in 1816, many ambitious canal and roadway projects were breaking ground across the United States, including the Erie Canal. In 1836, the Internal Improvement Act was passed by the state legislature, providing funding for 8 transportation projects that included the construction of roads, canals, and a new form of transportation called the railroads throughout the state. This 1836 package included funding for the construction of Indiana's first railroad line. Originally charted in 1832, construction began on the Madison, Indianapolis, and Lafayette Railroad on September 16, 1836. However, the railroad would only go as far as Indianapolis when completed years later. With the arrival of the railroad, Madison would continue to prosper as a riverfront city. But the state-funded project faced an incredible obstacle in reaching the growing downtown area: a 413-foot drop in elevation over a distance of 7,012 feet between North Madison and the Ohio River.
The Madison Incline is the steepest non-cog grade in North America. It has been in existence since the early 1840s. When they broke ground here originally in 1836, the reason they chose Madison was, as you looked at a map in the State House when they were passing the legislation to build a new railroad, they looked at that map and determined that Madison to Indianapolis was the shortest distance. Madison as a riverfront was considered to be the future of Indiana. It exceeded river traffic more than Cincinnati and Louisville combined at the time. But eventually the incline was the Achilles heel in the railroad. At the time the incline was built, they had done their engineering and determined that it would be no issue climbing this hill. However, after the first train went down the hill and back up the hill, they determined from then on that they would start bringing the cars up one at a time with horses and mules. To take the cars down, they would let them drift down on gravity and operate the handbrake. As you can imagine, with wet leaves and winter days, there was several accidents and several dead hogs at the bottom of the hill multiple times. With it being so steep, as soon as other railroads popped up, such as the line from Jeffersonville to Indianapolis, lines from Cincinnati, from the Ohio River, all the way up to Indianapolis, the line suddenly found itself into several receiverships, bankruptcies, and mergers. The fact that the line is in existence is the sheer determination of people in this area that kept this line going. And eventually it came back, and the railroad had to adapt through the years to how it came back.
Successful for 2 decades leading up to the Civil War, the railroad went into decline and was sold at foreclosure in 1862. Early on, the railroad developed a cog system to help prevent runaways, but this system proved to be unreliable due to seasonal changes affecting the infrastructure. Eventually, Reuben Wells, the chief mechanical officer of the Jeffersonville, Madison, and Indianapolis Railroad, invented a 10-wheel steam locomotive with a special boiler designed specifically for the incline in 1868. The locomotive was used in service on the incline up until 1898, serving 30 faithful years of service with no major incidents. Eventually, the JM&I would fall under the ownership of Pennsylvania Railroad in 1915, prompting changes in motive power up the hill.
When they got to the proving ground, there was a Y on the old Pennsylvania Railroad. They would Y the steam locomotive, put it back on the train, and they would come into town tender first. We can't find any pictures of a steam locomotive facing south coming into town.
In those days, the railroad was very, very active.
Yeah.
So as a little, some of my earliest memories, we lived there till I was 7 years old. But when I was 4 or 5 years old, you remember, what's that? Well, it's a train. Mm-hmm. And it was not uncommon for kids to go down and watch the trains going up and going down, because a lot of people also worked at State Hospital from the west end of town. They simply walked up the railroad cuts, and there was a stairway.
It's still there.
It's still there, where you got off and walked up.
Then in the 1950s, EMD got together with Pennsylvania Railroad and designed two specialty, what they called Cadillac locomotives. They were SD7s that were weighted down with extra weight. In addition, they designed a new wheel slip system that actually dropped the load off completely, so the engine would stop its electricity going to the wheels, sand automatically, and then once that sand was applied, the load would go back on those motors so that they didn't lose momentum. That later production move of automatic sanders was put into every EMD locomotive after that. In addition, they also had Gardner Denver design a 6-cylinder compressor. That also later became a production model compressor that was put in more locomotives, but the first two were in those SD7s.
By that time, I was in college. See?
So you probably
I went to college the fall of 50.
So you were in high school, you watch steam engines, you go away, get an education,
Right.
you come back, and steam engines are gone.
While I was in high school, they started building a power plant. And by that time, so much stuff was going on down there associated with the power plant, stuff coming in and going out by river, and also stuff coming in by rail.
Sure.
Going in and out of there. There was all kinds of activity in the west end of town, and it was just going on all the time,
It was busier than normal.
It was very busy.
Yeah.
Very busy. They had two industries down there. One was the shipyards, where they built and repaired basically barges and had done steamboats and so on. At that time, Meese Manufacturing was in there. They'd come in there about 1930. They had a shoe factory in there on the top 2 floors. This four-story building.
Right.
Meese Manufacturing made the canvas projects on the bottom 2 floors. And that's what's now Meese Arbitron done. They bought it out and moved it to the hilltop.
Right.
But when they moved up there, they were making canvas products. And then they got into the plastic, making stuff out of plastic.
Yeah.
Though the Pennsylvania Railroad was prosperous throughout the 1940s and 50s in the city of Madison, decline started in the early 1960s when the heavily regulated railroads faced fierce competition against trucking companies on the newly constructed interstate highway system. President Dwight D. Eisenhower's Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 marked the beginning of the modern transportation era, spawning thousands of miles of newly constructed roadways across the United States. In addition to the interstate highways taking a toll on the railroad industry, airlines were another contributing factor for the decline of mainline passenger service. This prompted the mergers of several Class I railroad companies in the 1960s, including the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central System. The two former arch-rival companies tied the knot in 1968, forming Penn Central Transportation. Because both railroads had similar routes and geography, branch lines on the Penn Central with less traffic were neglected for more favorable routes. As a result, because of the steep incline grade and the lesser freight business on the Madison branch, Indiana's first railroad line was forgotten and in serious jeopardy of being completely abandoned. By the 1970s, the entire Penn Central system was falling apart. Going bankrupt due to poor business practices and the declining market at the time, the railroad couldn't maintain track and infrastructure on many of its lines throughout the Midwest. Service on the Penn Central system was constantly being disrupted and delayed by daily derailments. During this time, the condition of the Madison branch was deplorable, and many of the shippers in the city were becoming concerned that they would forever lose their only connection to the nationwide rail system. Things started to change for the better when the city of Madison stepped in to save the railroad from total abandonment in 1978. Today, the Madison branch is now operated by the City of Madison Port Authority. Thanks to the efforts of the community leaders 40 years ago, what was once a nearly abandoned and neglected branch line is now one of Indiana's most successful short-line railroad companies. The Madison Railroad has beaten the test of time through proven, reliable, long-term stability and service for its valued customers. CEO Cathy Hale is proud of what the Madison Railroad has become, but recalls the many challenges they faced in the early years after acquiring the line from Penn Central Transportation.
I started my career with the railroad back in 1978, which is when the City of Madison took it over from the previous operator, which was CONRAIL. Prior to that, Penn Central. My name's Cathy Hale, and I'm the CEO of the Madison Railroad, which is a division of the City of Madison Port Authority. The community felt like future development, economic development, and the vitalness of the community depended on it.
The Madison Incline Grade, which still exists today, symbolizes the uphill battle the city-owned railroad faced in becoming a profitable short line during the infancy of its operation. Inheriting a tired and aging rail system with outdated and poorly maintained infrastructure from Penn Central and the defunct Madison Railway, the employees of the Madison Railroad worked hard to transform this once-forgotten branch line into a successful and profitable short-line railroad.
I think most of the industry wanted to have rail service available, whether they used it or not, and that's actually the way it originated. The city taking it over, a lot of the manufacturing concerns, the management got together and decided that we needed the railroad and formed the Port Authority. And at that time, there were plant managers and bankers and a lot of other people, and it wasn't really a political organization. Although the mayor appointed who it was, there was as many Republicans as there were Democrats.
It's totally bipartisan.
Yeah, totally, because the idea was to save the railroad and not let it be a political football.
Well, I guess the story really starts with Penn Central sort of getting out of the railroad business into the real estate business, and their biggest business was real estate. And as they were cutting costs, they looked at all their short lines and began to close them down and prepare them surplus. And our town had used the railroad, and we had some people that wanted to continue to use it. So the mayor at that time, a guy named Brooks Davis, who was a pharmacist in town, gathered a few of us who used the railroad and sat down and said, we've got to come up with some way to preserve our access to the main line. And that sort of began the study, and this was in the late 60s. And then I think of the railroad in sort of three distinct sort of phases. The first was the creation of the Madison Railroad, and that occurred because of Spence Snyder was able to develop a process by which the city of Madison could become a port authority, and a port authority gave them an authorization to run a railroad. And kind of a twisted set of logics, but that's exactly how it happened. And so the first phase, I guess, as I think of the Madison Railroad was when Spence was able to create the process by which the railroad could become owned by the city of Madison.
The railroad got embargoed. It was embargoed, I believe, about a month, and the city took that time to, they had already formed the Port Authority in their infinite wisdom, anticipating that it may shut down with Penn Central and CONRAIL prior to that, because CONRAIL operated the railroad for a little over a year after Penn Central. And then Madison Railway came along through the Public Service Commission, state of Indiana. And at that point, they formed local shipper groups and local governmental entities, and they put the package together to fund the railroad. They called the employees to see who would come back. Several of us did, and a couple of others took other employment. I was working at the circuit court clerk's office, and I had a friend that was working for an accounting firm. The accounting firm did the books for the Madison Railway, and she knew that they were looking for an employee that would do accounting and general agency work, is what they called it at the railroad, and I was looking for a better paying job. So I interviewed, got the job, same as Larry. Within the first month they had a contract, they being the Madison Railway, had a contract impasse with the state of Indiana, and the funds were going to be lowered, and so they announced that they were going to cease operations. Once the city took over, Larry was operations manager. We had Colonel Bishop, that was the general manager. After about a year or two, he left, and then Larry took over.
I had lived in Lexington, Kentucky, and had recently graduated from college at Eastern Kentucky University, and thought I wanted to work in manufacturing. So I sent out probably back then hundreds of resumes, and I had a friend that lived in Carrollton, Kentucky, and I was in college with him. And he said, send some resumes out for Carrollton, Kentucky and Madison, Indiana. So I did that and ended up working for a furniture manufacturer in Carrollton as my first job. My wife and I moved up here. Immediately realized that I did not care for manufacturing, and the person that I worked for at the furniture factory had a difference of opinion with the president and left. And one evening I got a call from her and said, she asked me, have you ever thought about going to work for a railroad? Mm-hmm. And I was quite surprised, because she had left the furniture factory and had gotten a job at Madison Railway in Madison, Indiana, which was the railroad prior to Madison Railroad, the city-owned operation. And so I said, well, I've never really given it a thought. And so I interviewed for the position. It was the nebulous title of manager trainee. We had a great interview, and my wife was there, and we really related well to the owners of the railroad then, and thought for sure it was a positive move. And then I had another opportunity pop up, and they called me about the railroad job, and I actually turned it down. And then the second opportunity didn't pan out, so I'm sitting there thinking, well, I've made a big mistake. I'm stuck in manufacturing, which I didn't like. And so a couple of weeks later, I got a follow-up call, and we talked, and they had actually made it more worthwhile if I came, and made the change and went to work for the railroad. And lo and behold, it was just a few weeks. We found out that they were going to close operations.
With the Penn Central Transportation's bankruptcy occurring in 1970 at a loss of over $2 billion in today's currency, a plan was developed by the United States Railway Association to save the railroad network under the provisions of the Regional Rail Reorganization Act of 1973. The outcome was that the federally owned Consolidated Rail Corporation, also known as CONRAIL, was formed to take over railroad properties and operations from Penn Central, with a final system plan being developed in 1975 to thin the massive rail network of unprofitable branch lines. This further put the deteriorating Madison branch at risk, as it was not included in the final system plan. The Penn Central Company, which was the holding company for all Penn Central transportation properties, would retain ownership of the now landlocked branch line. The track between North Vernon and Columbus had been abandoned in the spring of 1976, forcing rail customers in Madison to utilize the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad as a secondary Class I carrier. This increased shipping costs, and many feared the fate of the railroad was hanging in the balance. That same year, 2 years prior to the creation of the City of Madison Port Authority, a privately owned short-line railroad company called the Madison Railway was formed and selected to operate what was left of the branch line between North Vernon and Madison. Track conditions continued to deteriorate, with the last major maintenance project being completed in 1964 by the Pennsylvania Railroad. With the help of government subsidies under the 4R Act of 1976, Madison Railway would operate the line for 2 years under a lease agreement. However, in 1978, the Public Service Commission and the Madison Railway reached a contract impasse, and the Madison Railway announced plans to discontinue service. As a result, the operation was shut down, and Penn Central was planning to abandon the entire line between Madison and North Vernon. It was during this time that officials in Madison began to consider operating the railroad themselves in order to maintain service to the community. Spence Schneider was asked by city officials to represent the railroad as their attorney and assist with the petition and hearing.
By that time, it was apparent that the state just said, we're not going to subsidize these people anymore. They got a drop-dead deadline. But if you want to, you better file your petition before the Public Service Commission, now the IURC, and have your hearing. And any railroad will be entitled, or anybody that can run a railroad will be entitled to be a petitioner.
While serving as a state representative in the late 1970s, he drafted a bill, with the assistance of State Senator Wilfred Ulrich, that would allow the city municipal port authorities to operate short-line railroads not to exceed 50 miles in length. The bill, which passed in both the House and the Senate in 1977, gave the City of Madison Port Authority the right to operate the railroad if its petition was granted.
So we had this guy from the west end of town named Bill Helton. And he was one of these guys that had been hanging around railroads all his life. And he somehow got a lawyer he talked to a few people around here, and he somehow got a lawyer out of Indianapolis that agreed to represent him. So when the deadline came and we filed, we set up the Port Authority. July 3rd, it was right the day before July 4th.
Okay.
Set it up. The mayor appointed the 9 people on the Port Authority. They immediately had a meeting and selected Pritchard as chairman and Tom Nichols as vice chairman immediately. And we started functioning, and the first thing we did was we had to get a petition filed with the Public Service Commission to get a hearing as soon as possible so we could get the authority to run the railroad.
After a 3-day hearing in Indianapolis, the Madison Port Authority was granted the right to operate the railroad, which it leased from Penn Central for around $20,000 per month. Although the city didn't initially intend to purchase the railroad, it became apparent that it was worth considering. Operations for the city-owned Madison Railroad began in September of 1978. Part of the city's decision to purchase the railroad line was based on the fact that the city was already paying more than $200,000 a year just to lease the track from Penn Central. That fact, coupled with the notion that the government subsidies would lend support to the operation, motivated the city to enter into negotiations with Penn Central to purchase the track outright in 1981. After much negotiation, the city made a final offer to purchase the railroad from the company for $600,000. However, Penn Central would not accept the offer, contending that the railroad was worth much more. Due to Penn Central's uncompromising position, in 1981 the city filed a condemnation suit against Penn Central under the right of eminent domain. Penn Central requested a change of venue, and then the case was transferred to Scott County, Indiana. After several challenges were decided in the Port Authority's favor, the court ordered the track between Madison and North Vernon condemned. That ruling meant that the railroad could then be appraised by the court, and the final appraised value would be paid into the court, allowing the Port Authority to purchase the railroad from Penn Central. Penn Central appealed the purchase price, and the court set the matter for jury trial. It wasn't until March of 1984, after a 7-day trial, that the Scott County jury approved the final purchase price of the railroad for $307,000. Penn Central's evidence had exceeded $1 million, and the holding company made a critical mistake by cashing the Port Authority's check before the trial had ended, forfeiting their right to appeal the verdict.
I didn't understand. It's the only case I've ever had like that in almost 50 years. I didn't understand. And their expert lawyers from Indianapolis office didn't understand. By them cashing the check, we had satisfied all the conditions in the trial to accept full possession of the tract and go on. It was our tract from the instant we paid the money in. They screwed up. See, they thought they were going to drag it out some more.
Sure.
And somehow squeeze some more money out of us.
Right.
And they didn't get it done.
The legal battle was over. The City of Madison Port Authority finally owned the railroad. Madison's very own small-town country lawyer had outwit 3 of the finest attorneys from Philadelphia. Thanks to Spence Schneider's efforts, the City of Madison acquired the railroad for a fraction of what they had initially offered to Penn Central. Once the city possessed ownership of the railroad in 1984, improvements and repairs were made as subsidies and funds became available. However, in the early 1980s, the federal government drastically cut back railroad subsidies nationwide, leaving the Madison Railroad to contend with financial struggles and outdated track and infrastructure.
We found ourselves in the mud. We found ourselves derailing 3 or 4 times just trying to go 20 miles. To go from Madison to North Vernon literally took sometimes 2 days. Due to track conditions being deplorable, the last major tie project was done in 1964. Therefore, we went from 1964 to 78 with 0 maintenance done on this line.
Well, unfortunately, Penn Central had let a lot of the track go into bad disrepair all over because they knew that they were going to be abandoning sections. So Madison Railroad at that time was in what they call accepted, less than quality standards, below class 1 minimum. So accepted, EXCEPTED, means below the minimum standards. So our entire track was accepted track, which meant we were getting 25 miles of dilapidated rail and trying to operate on that. Back in those days, people would refer to the rail as the back and forth empty or the wooden axle.
Prior to having the engine house, you obviously had to do federally mandated locomotive inspections. And Larry may be able to relate to this. How in the world did you do a federally mandated locomotive inspection without a pit?
Well, we had a pit, sort of.
Okay.
It was a man-made pit.
Madison Railway, when I first came on board, they had dug a pit between ties in North Madison by the office. So literally they had removed 2 ties and they had dug a pit. It wasn't very deep. I mean, maybe this much. And then they would position the locomotive over the, like if you're going to inspect your traction motors, or you're going to inspect the wheels, or you're going to put in some crater, the lube for the gears and the traction motors, that literally you would position the locomotive over that, and then a guy would crawl down in that hole and lay there and do the work. I mean, it's just like this. And then he would get out, and then they would reposition the locomotive, and he would crawl under there and do it again. Now, occasionally we were able to get the locomotive in at the engine house in JPG. The only thing we have to do is just call and ask permission. Then after a little while, they generally would let us do that. But we were bringing in a lot of freight back then from Jefferson Proving Ground. We were bringing in a lot of cannon tubes for testing, and
Or inert shell casings, the inch-thick plywood that they blew holes through.
and what was really interesting is we brought in Abrams tanks. Of course, this was Vietnam era, and it was really interesting when we get those tanks come in. A lot of them did not have turrets on them. The turrets would be shipped separately, so you could look down inside the tank more or less. And but so we were in there a lot. We had built some relationships with some of the staff, and they would let us say if we were in there for something and we were close to that building, we generally could run in there to do something. Because it's the pit that we own now, the engine house.
Talking locomotives real quickly, the original locomotive you started with was a lease locomotive for Madison Railway, the SW1. At some point, though, you purchased your first locomotive, and that was your 100% of your locomotive fleet for many, many years, from what I understand.
Absolutely.
What was it like, one, getting that locomotive, and how did you guys acquire that locomotive?
Hank Vince was on the Port Authority. He worked at Ivy Tech Community College, but before that he worked for the city of Madison at the mayor's office, I believe. And so Hank was acquainted with some of those type things. And he wrote the grant, and we received a $190,000 UDAG grant. And that was the Precision National engine that we purchased, the GP9 that was modified to a 10.
We at that time it was very difficult to find power because there was a big demand. But we were lucky enough to find this Paducah rebuild GP9, and we still have today. It's 3634. It was in Precision National colors when we first got it, the yellow and green. And I'd never operated a locomotive except for the little SW1, which is a switcher, 600 horsepower switcher, small, quite direct drive, a lot of traction, a lot of tractive effort. And I was so excited when I found out the other locomotive, 3634, had come in. We had an engine man that met us up there and made it roadworthy for us and gave us like a 10-minute, here's where all the controls are. I do remember I couldn't get it to load. I'm sitting there and it should be going and it's not loading. He said, oh yeah, I forgot something. He went up, did something else. I don't even know what he did. But I'll never forget the difference. I thought, we've got this little NW or SW1 that was an old worn out unit, and here's this nice rebuilt GP9, and I said, I don't like this because it wouldn't load. It just seemed like take forever, and it was so slow building up steam, as it were. And then I found out that there's also a switch on that for switching and road, and it didn't come in on road, which is nice, smooth build up for traction and all this kind of stuff. So we put it over on switching, and then I had that more immediate connection to the wheels, similar to, but not as direct as the SW1. But something else I wasn't used to is the SW1 had old coil spring suspension on the trucks. So that thing was like really hard. It didn't bounce. It just was not comfortable. As you're riding down the road, if you didn't have that nice padded engineer's seat, it beat you to death, literally, because the rail was in such bad condition, and it would jerk from the kinks and the cross-level problems and things. But then when I got in 3634, once I got across the diamond in North Vernon, we were on regular track. Man, this thing's wonderful. It's like going from a go-kart to a Cadillac. But we were so proud when we got that we were a real railroad when we got that one. And that's the only unit we had for a long time. And when it broke, we had to get it fixed as soon as possible. And that's something we just couldn't happen. It just couldn't. We couldn't fail to serve an industry because they would kill a small railroad like us.
So early days of operations, can you both share a little bit on what it was like to run down the incline? I mean, Larry, you were an engineer. Cathy, you would see them coming in, I'm sure, white-knuckled some days. What was an average day on the Madison Railroad like running down that incline? And what's some of the scary things that you remember that just like really caused you to have white knuckles?
What I mentioned earlier, I didn't have a lot of experience doing that, and And the train crew, the Madison Railway train crew that was training me, was telling me the stories about this and was telling me how dangerous the hill was and really setting me up. And then one of them went over to a cabinet in the locomotive and he opened it. This was when we were first in training, and after they told me this story about the runaway train, one of them, and I can't remember which, went over and got a cardboard box out of someplace in the cab of the locomotive, and they were just talking to me, and they were taking their rings off, taking their watches off, and taking their wallets off. All the train crew was in there. Was two of them and me, and they're putting it in the box, and they handed it to me and says, "Well, put all your valuables in here." And I'm sitting there thinking, what in the world is going on? And I said, "What's this for?" He said, "Well, if we ever have a runaway train, the last survivor gets the whole box and all the personal items." And of course, my face, isn't that, dangerous? They rolled and was just laughing. It was a big setup. So years later, Bob Center, when Bob and I were the train crew, we used to do that with newbies when they'd come on, or we'd get somebody from the community. We would always try to pull that on. Just imagine seeing their faces. For me, just before I became an engineer in Madison Railway, and before I came to work for them, they had actually had an incident on the hill where they had a brake failure with the locomotive that they were running, and they were running the duct work, not duck, but ducks, down from Rexnord plant, and they lost the brakes on the train, and there happened to be a TV crew on board that was filming the whole thing. There's a Louisville channel, and the train started building up speed. The brakes failed. The engineer ordered everybody off the train, and the train went all the way down to the bottom of the hill, ran all around the curve, and went to Weinberg's scrapyard, which is distant end, south end of the track, and hooked up to a gondola that was setting down there by itself. And we were very, very fortunate that it went through the grade crossings by itself, and no one was injured. The train crew, the TV crew actually
Jumped, didn't they?
They jumped, yeah. When the engineer ordered them off the train, they literally jumped.
I wrote it a number of times, but when you're managing the office and inside, and you're listening to the moves on the radio, and when something unusual is going on, you pick it up, your ear picks it up because you're always listening. And there was one time when Bob Center was inspecting the track, and all of a sudden I noticed that the radio, he started to say something and everything went blank. And I don't know what I thought I was going to do, but our offices were there at Scott Callicott by the foot of the incline, and I just took off running down the incline. And it turns out that a huge boulder fell right in front of him, and he was speechless. When we got to him, he was white. He couldn't speak. I mean, it barely missed him. And it was the size of a large truck. So things like that, and that's why we've never really considered passengers on the incline. But wet leaves, rain, sand. Another time the sanders plugged. You put white silica sand in them from bags, but somehow or another there were pebbles, and the sanders got plugged, and it started to rain, and the locomotive started going down the hill.
The last time the Madison Railroad operated over the incline was in 1992, when the short line delivered high and wide transformers to the Clifty Creek Power Plant on the Ohio River.
Well, the incline is actually still retained by the City of Madison Port Authority. It's complete, meaning all the rail, the ties, and everything are there. We had a major refurbishment on it for historical purposes about 4 years ago. I think it was 2013. When that was complete, it was open to the public for hiking and what have you. However, there are dangers of falling rock in the middle cut. The middle cut is very undercut. At the time that the railroad was built, some of the techniques that the railroad used were not what we would do today. Normally you would cut back a hill at an angle. This was somewhat straight up. So over time, water has eroded away, and there are times when you look up there, you may see 20, 30 foot of rock hanging over your head. So we still have quite a few rocks that fall in that location. We currently have a section that has slid off and down into the valley previously. When we went to rebuild the incline, that particular section the rail was all slid over on good ground. Within a year of the project being done, we found a fairly large crack developing. And now it is not even safe to take a high rail vehicle on, which we used to be able to do. It is there for the purpose of if we ever need to go back down it for some reason. We don't foresee that. It would take millions of dollars to put it back in service.
Though the incline was a major challenge to maintain and operate in the early days, the Madison Railroad faced other track and infrastructure challenges over the entire 25-mile main line. Poor track, ties, bridges, and crossings had to be repaired. Finances were tight, and the railroad could only make minor improvements. But with the help of local industries and state and local governments, the railroad was able to maintain operations during difficult times of financial uncertainty. Grants allowed the Madison Railroad to make small but necessary infrastructure upgrades that would eventually open the pathway to becoming a successful and reliable transportation company. In 1988, Larry Keith, general manager of the Madison Railroad at the time, was leaving to pursue another career in hospital administration. Cathy Hale was promoted as the new general manager and soon began attending meetings and railroad conferences. This is where she met Bob Shaw of the Algiers, Winslow, and Western Railway. Shaw, a kind Southern gentleman, would soon become a lifelong friend, rail advisor, mentor, and spiritual compass to Cathy, and at the age of 92, he still serves in that capacity.
I went from somebody that didn't know nothing to somebody that knows just a little bit. Basically, I learned from the sweat of my brow from mentors like Bob Shaw, Jerry Jacobson, Bill Strong. Throughout the history, you never learn anything from a small town at home, no railroads around, and the generosity of everybody, just a little at a time, and you have your mentors like Larry Keith, Jerry Thaden, and everybody who believes in you and helps you, and when you leave the world, that you hope you can pass a little bit on to the people behind you and pay it forward.
For the first 15 years of operation, the railroad struggled to succeed, but everything would change for the City of Madison Port Authority in the mid-1990s with the acquisition of the Jefferson Proving Ground engine house facilities and 17 miles of storage track within the former military base. The Proving Ground would open a new opportunity for the Madison Railroad to gain financial freedom through the car storage business.
We have worked very hard as a team and a board and a community to find grant monies along with revenue earnings and paired those together to partner and upgrade. We've been able to do a number of projects to where we were eligible for some grants, and then we had some of our own funds. And then in 1995, with the acquisition of the engine house and the 15 miles of rail in the former Jefferson Proving Ground, was a real turning point for us. I realized the value of the rail out here. My intentions were that the facility with the acreage would be an economic development boost, but until such time we would be able to fill it up with rail cars and earn revenues from car storage. The car storage has developed and flourished and allowed us to accumulate funds to where we upgraded and replaced 2 railroad bridges and upgraded 3 others to 286,000 pound. In addition to putting in 5 miles, we took out the old 85-pound rail and upgraded to 115 pound. And then in some areas it was only 70 pound. So we did manage to upgrade the last miles to the 115 pound. And any new crossings we put in, we're also putting a 115 pound rail in. And so all of our track is a minimum of 100 pound rail.
As you can see here, the rail is 115 pound Steel Dynamics rail, which was built in Indiana. This was just laid 2 years ago. This is part of the infrastructure that we built because this was 70-pound rail. Could not handle the larger 286,000-pound cars. So with the new rail, we are ready for service. We are ready for customers in Madison.
I think the biggest single change I've seen with the railroad has been the ability to upgrade the facilities. Rails provides more engines without needing to go to the public for any funds. We're self-sustaining and have been that way for a good number of years, which I think is a very positive step for the railroad. I believe the real benefit for the railroad has been the ability to upgrade the track, upgrade the bridges, so that we can provide a different service. We can handle heavier loads. We can provide to the city the ability to offer to a potential customer, as an example, railroad service, which I think would be very limited without the ability to upgrade like we've done.
If you look at economic development, if a community doesn't have a railroad, for instance, Madison Precision Products, Century Tube, Lowe's in North Vernon, none of them would have located in our communities without rail service, because if there is a trucker strike or if prices go up, they want to know that they have the rail as a backup, or to say to the truckers, you know, if you don't keep your price in line, we can use rail. And while that doesn't pay our bills, it does equate to a number of jobs for the community as a result of the rail continuing to be here.
Railroad here in North Vernon, that's what made North Vernon, was all the different railroads. The industry grew because of the railroad. That's really what made our nation, was the railroad. My name is Mike Oakes. I'm the mayor of North Vernon. I feel that the Madison Railroad is very vital to our city because of the impact that it has on the different industries that we have. Hilux is very important because of the products they receive from the Madison Railroad. If it wasn't for the Madison Railroad, we wouldn't have the industry that we have. And I'm very glad that they're here. And I'm glad to be a mayor of this town that has the opportunity to provide the service that the Madison Railroad can do. I would like to think that things are starting to pick up now, because they're starting to see that the rail is a better way to ship. It's more productive. You can ship more by rail than you can by road.
The nice thing with us being an in-point short line is that we work directly with the Class 1, so that you have a better customer service, more connected to the cars and the shipments that are being put into the industries. So we're right there. When you call us, it's not a customer service desk, 200 miles away. It's a service desk that's seeing that exact crew that day in regards to the switching moves they're going to make. So on our behalf, we find ourselves available to our customers 24/7, where a lot of the larger railroads, you're going to be talking to a help desk.
Unfortunately, we had people here in Madison that worked very hard and were creative to keep the railroad going. For a while, it took the city of Madison and North Vernon and the two counties to help, but over time, the railroad became self-sufficient. In fact, the railroad has become a lot more independent as far as finances, and done very well in the last several years, and that's good. There have been businesses coming in both communities that have a need for railroads. They have rail transportation, rail deliveries, and that's been a good thing. I know there's a particular business in North Vernon wouldn't be there if it weren't for the railroad. There are several hundred jobs sitting in this particular factory. It's a plastic factory. The raw material is delivered by rail. It's a much more efficient way to do it for them. It saves them money. They started out with several hundred jobs, and since then they've added on another recycling plant. There's another couple of hundred jobs that are involved in that too. It's not but one of the bigger employers in North Vernon, and a lot of people make a living by doing that, and they wouldn't be able to do that without the railroad being there. So it's been very important. There's been other industries and businesses that have looked in this area, and they haven't always needed the railroad at that particular time, but they wanted the railroad available in case their business came to the point where they did need rail service. So they wanted to have that access available even if they weren't using it at that particular time.
My name is Cathy Goode, and I am the administrative manager here for Madison Railroad. This is my 18th year with the Madison Railroad. One of my primary functions is customer service and customer interaction. I work closely with Brian Vance at Hilux Poly on making sure that he receives the rail cars that he is in need of. We can provide a specialized service for Hilux, specifically if they request a certain rail car in a certain position within their spur, we can go out and set that up and make sure that that material is located in that specific spot. That's important because they have different melting points that the plastic inside the rail car melts at, and it helps them produce a better product. So another customer of ours is Mod Roto. They don't ship as many cars inbound for them. We probably interchange with them about once every 4 to 6 weeks, depending on their demand. Work closely with Marilyn Fancher. She communicates with me when they are getting low on their rail car and when it's ready to be pulled. Since they don't have as many rail cars on their siding, they like to make sure that as soon as the rail car is empty, that it is returned. So again, communicating with her on a very routine basis to make sure that they are supplied, and that when their rail car supply is empty, that empty rail car is pulled as quickly as possible. We pay very close attention to detail. We want to do anything that we can do to help draw those customers to locate in Madison. Several years ago, we had a county commissioner that went on record fighting for the railroad and the importance of the railroad being in Madison. It is a huge draw for companies that want to locate here. We had a company that located and basically said they came to Madison because the rail was here, and that's vital.
As far as economic development is concerned, it's a check mark that we have a viable railroad here. And exciting thing is it connects communities. As you well know, it already brings in some goods to I know at least one of our businesses, and the other thing is we can use it as an incentive because some of the spurs that are not being used today could, if we got down the road and we needed that, we know that would be an option for someone. So it's a very viable part. We talk about the railroad all the time. It's just a fantastic thing that we like to talk about here in Madison.
Well, the first thing was just nobody ever thought our railroad would still be around. And the fact that 40 years later we're still here and not abandoned, scrapped out. The next memory would be the acquisition of the Jefferson Proving Ground, where our dreams started to come true, where we didn't operate in the red anymore and we were in the black, and we could actually start fixing up the line. My dream was to make everything 286 compliant as years went on and be able to do what we needed to do to the railroad bridges. And one piece at a time, we've been able to do that, and to replace the 5 miles of 70-pound rail. And so last year that became a reality, and then come next year, we're going to be in good shape from Madison all the way to North Vernon, and I think just completing that vision, I can at that point rest and hand it off.
Being the oldest rail line, the first railroad in the state of Indiana, it's also a historic town. The community itself provides a great setting for company growth, but our specialized service is what really future customers should really focus on, is the fact that we pay attention to those details. We want to make sure that they're producing a great product, and that's done by us producing great service for that company. So the fact that we're here locally, if they want to reach out to us or even get in their vehicle and drive from into town out here to the proving grounds where our offices are located, they can do that and not have to worry about going very far distances to other company headquarters. They're going to deal with us. We've got 7 employees, so chances are you're going to speak to the highest level with the answer of the phone call. So if there is ever an issue, they can get service and they can get questions answered right away versus having to wait for a call back or traveling greater distances. Our crews interact with the CSX train crews actually doing interchanges in North Vernon. However, we also have a great relationship with those contacts in Jacksonville. We have that open dialogue of communication. It just helps all customers all the way around. For us to be in the know, for them to be in the know, and for CSX. And by having those close connections, we can communicate and make both of our businesses a lot better. We are able to get our cars in and out faster now, and that's a great advantage for the customer. They like to see those cars moving, not just the inbound loaded cars, but once those inbound loads are emptied by our customers, the shipper likes to receive those cars back. Boil it down, it's all about money, and so they can get those empty cars back, refill them, and out back into the market.
The Madison Railroad has come a long way since its formation in 1978. The short line has beaten the test of time through proven, reliable long-term stability and service for its valued customer base. With a strong and experienced management team, the Madison Railroad is ready to service your transportation needs. For more information on our history, services, and motive power, visit our website at madisonrailroad.com. The Madison Railroad, celebrating 40 years of local service nationwide.